Driving the night bus was both a blessing and a curse. The quiet streets and empty seats offered a serene respite from the chaos of the day, but the eerie silence and deserted neighborhoods could be unsettling. I had grown used to the routine, picking up the last few passengers, dropping them off, and driving the bus back to the depot. It was a job that required vigilance, especially in the more desolate parts of town where the shadows seemed to stretch on forever. One particular night, the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the empty streets. I had just picked up my last passenger, an older man in a worn suit, carrying a tattered briefcase. He boarded without a word, his eyes downcast, and took a seat at the back of the bus. There was something about him that sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off as paranoia. As I drove through the deserted neighborhood, the street lights flickered strangely. The man remained silent, staring out the window, his face illuminated by the passing lights. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw his reflection flicker, as if he were a ghost. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the bus. I turned on the radio, hoping for some background noise, but it only picked up static. Frustrated, I turned it off and continued driving. We passed by rows of abandoned houses, their windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching our every move. The man at the back shifted in his seat, and I couldn't help but glance at him again. His gaze was now fixed on me, his eyes dark and hollow. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly looked away, focusing on the road ahead. As we neared the end of the route, I noticed something strange. The houses seemed to be getting older, more decrepit, as if we were traveling back in time. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to creep in, enveloping the bus in a thick white blanket. I slowed down, peering through the mist, trying to make out the road ahead. Suddenly, the bus lurched, and I slammed on the brakes. The man stood up, his eyes never leaving mine, and slowly made his way to the front of the bus. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each step sending a jolt of fear through me. He stopped just behind my seat, his breath cold on my neck. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond, just pointed towards the fog. I turned to look, and as the mist cleared, I saw it. A cemetery, old and forgotten, with crumbling tombstones and overgrown weeds. The bus had somehow come to a stop at the entrance, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The man stepped off the bus, and as he did, the fog seemed to part, revealing a path leading into the heart of the cemetery. He turned back to me, his eyes now filled with a sorrowful emptiness, and gestured for me to follow. I hesitated, but something compelled me to step outside. The air was frigid, and the silence was deafening. I followed the man down the path, the fog swirling around us like restless spirits. The tombstones were ancient, their inscriptions worn away by time. The man stopped in front of one, a particularly old and weathered stone, and knelt down. As I approached, I saw the name etched into the tombstone. His name. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was seeing. The date of death was decades ago. Yet here he was, standing before me. The man turned to me, his eyes filled with an indescribable sadness, and spoke for the first time. "I was never meant to leave," he said, his voice a haunting whisper. "But I got lost, and now I can't find my way back." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog thickened, and the man began to fade, his form dissolving into the mist. I turned and ran back to the bus, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, the fog pressing against the windows. The bus roared to life, and I drove as fast as I could, the cemetery disappearing behind me. The fog eventually lifted, and I found myself back in the familiar streets of the deserted neighborhood. But the feeling of dread remained, clinging to me like a shadow. I drove the bus back to the depot, my hands shaking. my mind racing with what I had just experienced. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but I knew one thing for certain: I had encountered something beyond this world. Driving a taxi at night can be a lonely job, but I always found a certain solace in the quiet, the hum of the city giving way to the whispering secrets of the night. Most of my fares were routine: bars, clubs, late-night diners, but occasionally I'd get a ride that was anything but ordinary. This story is about one such night, a night that started like any other, but ended in a way I'll never forget. It was around 2 a.m. when I got the call. A couple needed a ride to a hotel on the outskirts of town. They flagged me down just outside a trendy downtown bar. The man was tall and well-dressed, wearing a dark suit that seemed a bit too formal for a night out. The woman, on the other hand, wore a flowing red dress that shimmered under the streetlights. They looked like they had stepped out of a different era, their elegance contrasting sharply with the surrounding nightlife. They slid into the back seat, the man giving me an address in a low, smooth voice. I punched it into my GPS and started driving. The route took us out of the city, the bright lights fading into darkness as we headed towards the more remote areas. The couple was quiet, whispering to each other occasionally, but mostly just staring out the windows. The drive was long, and the road wound through dense forests and desolate fields. The farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the night seemed off, a heavy silence pressing in around us. The GPS indicated we were close, but I saw no sign of a hotel. Just as I was about to ask the man if we were on the right track, he spoke up. "It's just a little further," he said, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I continued driving, the road becoming rougher, the trees closing in around us. Finally, I saw it. A large, old-fashioned hotel looming out of the darkness. It was isolated, with no other buildings in sight. The place looked like it hadn't seen guests in years, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and decay. I parked in front, and the couple stepped out. The man leaned in through the open window, his cold eyes meeting mine. "Wait here. We'll be right back to pay." I nodded, feeling an unexplainable dread as I watched them walk towards the entrance. The hotel doors opened with a creak, and they disappeared inside. Minutes turned into an hour, and there was still no sign of them. The hotel stood silent, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. I honked the horn, but there was no response. Frustrated, I got out of the car and approached the entrance. The lobby was dark and musty, filled with old furniture, covered in dust. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I was determined to get my fare. I ventured deeper into the hotel, the silence pressing in around me. The place was a labyrinth of dark hallways and empty rooms. I searched for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of the couple. Finally, I stumbled upon a grand ballroom. The chandelier hung crookedly from the ceiling, its crystals glinting in the faint light. At the far end of the room, I saw them. They were dancing, their figures ghostly in the dim light. The man held the woman close, their movements graceful and slow. But something was terribly wrong. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow. They moved like marionettes, pulled by invisible strings. A chill ran down my spine as I watched, unable to look away. The music I hadn't noticed before grew louder, a haunting melody that filled the room. Suddenly, they stopped and turned to look at me, their eyes piercing into my soul. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I burst out of the hotel and into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I jumped into my taxi and sped away, the dark silhouette of the hotel fading into the distance. I drove back to the city in a daze, my mind racing with what I had seen. It wasn't until I was back under the comforting glow of the streetlights that I realized something. My fare meter was still running, showing an amount I couldn't afford to lose. I glanced in the rear-view mirror and froze. There, on the back seat, was a small, worn suitcase. It hadn't been there before. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and opened it. Inside were old clothes, a photograph, and a bundle of letters. The photograph showed the couple standing in front of the same hotel, but it was dated over 50 years ago. The letters were love notes and mentions of a tragic accident that had separated them. My heart pounded as I realized the truth. They weren't just any couple. They were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over. I left the suitcase on the curb and drove away, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I never spoke of that night to anyone, but it haunted me. The memory of their hollow eyes and the eerie melody of their dance. Now, every time I drive past the outskirts of the city, I can feel their presence, a cold shiver running down my spine. And I know they're still there, waiting for their next dance, their next chance to relive the night that never ends. The night had always been my ally. As a delivery driver, the quiet hours allowed me to navigate the winding roads with ease, unimpeded by the usual hustle and bustle of the day. My route often took me through a dense forest, a dark labyrinth of towering trees that seemed to close in around me as I drove. It was eerie, yes, but I'd grown accustomed to the solitude and the rhythmic hum of my truck's engine. However, there was one thing I could never quite shake off: the laughter. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my tires on the gravel road. But it was there, lurking in the shadows. It started a few months ago, just a whisper at first, and gradually grew louder each night. At times, it felt as if it was right next to me, a sinister presence that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or my overactive imagination. That night, I decided to put an end to it. I had just made my last delivery and was heading back home. The forest enveloping me in its inky darkness. The laughter started again, louder and more persistent than ever. It echoed through the trees, taunting me, daring me to find its source. Enough, I muttered to myself, pulling over to the side of the road. I turned off the engine, plunging the forest into an eerie silence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin. The forest was a maze of shadows, my flashlight cutting through the darkness in narrow beams. I followed the laughter, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became. It felt as if the trees were watching me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shapes on the trees, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. I had never been this far into the forest before, and every step filled me with a growing sense of dread. After what felt like hours, I arrived at a clearing. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling tomb, covered in moss and vines. The laughter was deafening now, reverberating off the stones, filling the air with its malevolent presence. I approached the tomb cautiously, the sense of unease growing with each step. The tombstone was weathered and unreadable, but the laughter seemed to be emanating from within. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam piercing the black void. The air inside was musty, a cold draft seeping out and chilling me to the bone. The tomb was small, barely enough room to stand, and at the center was an ancient sarcophagus, its lid slightly ajar. With trembling hands, I pushed the lid further open, the stone grinding against stone in a dreadful symphony. Inside lay a skeletal figure, draped in tattered remnants of clothing. The laughter reached a fever pitch, and I felt a cold hand grip my heart. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. In the dim light, I saw it. A shadowy figure rising from the sarcophagus, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The laughter was coming from it, a ghoulish smile etched on its spectral face. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing as I backed away from the tomb. The figure followed, its laughter echoing in the night, a haunting melody that seemed to seep into my very soul. I turned and ran, the forest a blur around me. The laughter pursued me, growing louder and more distorted with every step. I tripped and fell, the rough ground scraping my hands and knees, but I forced myself to keep moving. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around me, their branches tearing at my clothes. I could feel the presence behind me, its icy breath on my neck. I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. My truck was my only refuge, a beacon of safety in the oppressive darkness. I burst through the undergrowth, my truck finally coming into view. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The laughter was right outside, a maddening chorus that rattled the windows and shook the very air around me. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally managed to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and I floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the gravel before gaining traction. I sped down the forest road, the laughter fading into the distance. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing with what I had seen. I didn't stop until I was out of the forest, the familiar lights of the town bringing a sense of relief. I never drove that route again. I couldn't bear the thought of going back, of hearing that laughter once more. The memory of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence lurking in the forest. I often wondered what it was, why it was there, and what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. But some questions are better left unanswered.